Joining me today for the interview is Katie White. Katie is an assessment author, speaker, and consultant from Melfort, Saskatchewan. And like Nicole a few weeks back, Katie is one of my dearest friends and one of my closest colleagues. So I'm excited to have Katie on the show. Katie is also a fellow Canadian. So that's back-to-back weeks with the Canadians. We had Josh last week. We've got Katie this week. So Canadians everywhere. She is the author of two books, 2017's Softening the Edges, Assessment Practices That Honor K-12 Teachers and Learners, and 2019's Unlocked, Using Assessment as the Key to Everyday Creativity in the Classroom. Katie is a force when it comes to workshop facilitation. Katie White is actually a verb. My colleagues Mandy, Garnett, and I often talk about when we design workshops, we often talk about using chart paper, and our reference is we're going to Katie White the heck out of this workshop. So Katie knows exactly what I'm talking about. So with all of that, Katie, in all seriousness, I want to welcome you to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about stuff that I really care about. So I'm pretty excited about this conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited too. And I have just tremendous respect for your perspective, your gifts and talents as a facilitator, and certainly have admired the way that you go about this work. So I'm excited to have you on. And I want to dig right into to assessment and talk first about your journey. You know, you are obviously now an author and an expert in sound assessment practices. You are a sought after speaker. You are sought after workshop facilitator. But of course, like many of us, you didn't start your career that way. I mean, I always like to remind workshop participants in my workshops that, you know, there was no one who is more steeped in traditional grading than I was in the early 1990s when I began my career. And now I'm at a place where I've done a complete 180 on all of that. So can you share with us two things? First, why assessment? And then also, what is the arc of your assessment journey?
So what I know now is that assessment is the center of everything. And you talk about that a lot too, Tom. Like it's what drives all decision making in a classroom context, right? So that's why assessment. But like for me, when I originally got into it, it was the pebble in my shoe when I taught, is what I would call it. Like for 15 years. I went into teaching with an open heart. I was excited about planning. I was heavy on the engagement, and you know, I Katie Whited the heck out of teaching, and and so it was a real passion for me. But what ended up happening is, like, 3 times a year, I had to rein in the joy and calculate a grade, and that was the first step of the sort of disconnect. And then the second part was conference time, sitting down with families and talking about a report card as opposed to the experience. So I'll tell a little story. About 12 years into teaching, I taught a 4-5 combined classroom. For 1 year, I just had this weird teaching assignment. And it's like one of my favorite years that I think of. You know, we started building relationships and cohesion as a class because we were 2 grades coming together, and we did experiential learning, and we built sculptures, and we did labs outside, and it was just the best year. And in the first reporting period and conferences, we had student-led conferences, and this was in a community where I've lived for lots of my life, so I knew the families, and they would come in, and then we would sit and we would talk about this number. It was just the number. Like, how did we get at the number? How did you make decisions about the number? And it was just this conversation. And I felt like really sad that we couldn't talk about all that other stuff, the magic, right? It was like popping a balloon is how it felt. And so I just think about that year, and I think about I started to really feel the disconnect between those two things. And then I got this weird job as a vice principal for a year of a 6 to 12 school. So I changed schools and I became a vice principal. And my director of education at the time came and visited me, and he said, here's a stack of old educational leadership magazines from ASCD. I think you have leadership potential. I think you should read some of this. So I just started reading. And in the summer, I took the magazines on a staycation in a hotel while my husband was marking provincial math assessments and my kids were in the pool. And I remember opening up the issue. I've kept it. It was called Data-Driven Decision Making. And Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe had written an article in there about data-driven decision making. And I distinctly remember sitting on that fake lawn chair by that fake pool and like my mind was blown. Truly, it was an absolute paradigm shift because it had never occurred to me that assessment could actually drive instructional decision making. It had never occurred to me. And I was so excited. I could hardly wait to get back to my town so that I could get into my units and start replanning them. I was just completely enchanted with this idea. And then I think like the next year, I think I got a job as a differentiated instruction facilitator, where I was co-teaching with teachers. And so our group would meet regularly, and we were becoming, like, our focus was instruction, but we were obsessed with assessment. We started talking about how you couldn't differentiate without pre-assessment or formative assessment, or how could you even, and so we really shifted, and we reached out and contacted Grant Wiggins, who replied, and we started really working on UBD. And I would say, like, that's why assessment, and that's really where that's how the journey got me deep into it. Once I had that paradigm shift, I couldn't let it go. And I was just really excited. And so my jobs changed and I started having to do some of that work. And then the last thing in my journey that I have to mention is our province underwent a massive curriculum redo, K to 12, much like BC over the last few years. And we were forced to reckon with assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I was fully in.
Yeah.
And then Tom Schimmer discovered me, and then here I am.
Let's not
for 10 years.
Right. Let's not push it, Katie. It's interesting because I think many of us have a similar experience of thinking about assessment as, early in our careers, thinking about it as a silo. I teach over here, and then I assess you, and then I come back to building relationships. I come back to teaching. I come back to engagement. And then there's this thing over here that I have to keep doing a few times a year. And I think, I have a similar story in the sense that once I just, learned about not just assessment as an integral part of instruction, but also from a relationship building perspective, that's when it all kind of clicked for me as well. So in 2017, you you published Softening the Edges, and you use this metaphor, which I just think is brilliant. The hard edges and the soft edges to explore sound assessment practices. So for listeners who might not be familiar with that metaphor and sort of the general content of the book or haven't read the book, can you draw the contrast for us between a hard edge and a soft edge in assessment?
Okay, so the way that I think about it is no assessment practice in and of itself has a hard or a soft edge. So, whether we're talking about pre-assessment or self-assessment or summative assessment or reporting, any of those things, they can have either a hard or a soft edge. So what I mean by that, the edge is, or the metaphor refers to the idea that, the foundational understanding of how to do something like assessment is solid. We've got lots of research. We know lots of things. But sometimes when I'm working with teachers, I notice that they, if I even say the word assessment, it's almost like I compare it to like a paper cut, where you get that cut and you're like, oh, that's horrible. And then you forget about it. And then you squeeze a line for a margarita, and then you feel it again and you're like, oh, that's horrible. And it's just this sort of recursive pain that, it doesn't linger. We mostly do our jobs, and then we interface with assessment, and it's painful for some reason. And so I started to think about the idea of softening the edges, like a carpenter, would sand a coffee table and get the splinters off, or, you add sugar to vinegar and get a nice sauce. And it's just taking something and thinking about how you can adjust it slightly so that when people interact with it, it's not like a paper cut. And so when we go back to the idea that every assessment practice can have a hard or soft edge, we have to start thinking about things like needs that people have. So usually, you know, when you give kids an assessment experience, you're serving an intellectual need. You're trying to build their knowledge. You're assessing their knowledge. You're trying to figure out where to move, and that's all makes sense in an educational setting. That's our job. But if we neglect to think about the social health of kids, the emotional health, even their physical health, like getting them to write for extended periods where your like spine hurts from doing that, all of those things about being
Yeah.
a human, if we neglect those other parts of ourselves, we can end up with a hard edge. And so
Hmm.
the book is about how to take a practice
Hmm.
and think about it through the intellectual lens, of course, but then also the social, emotional, physical
Right.
lenses, so that it lands on kids and on teachers in a healthy and humane way.
Yeah. So can you maybe, just as a follow-up, think about an assessment practice that has a hard edge that you could then soften. So think about a traditional assessment practice that might, traditionally feel or be executed or implemented as a hard edge, but because of the teacher's sort of attention, it's now a soft edge. Any examples you could share?
Well, for me, my big one is pre-assessment, because that's where we started in that differentiated instruction group. So we started really investigating pre-assessment because we knew it was important for making decisions.
Right.
And there's a couple of ways to do pre-assessment, and I think that's what makes it a little bit challenging or gets us those hard edges. Like there's the
Mhm.
diagnostic pre-assessment where we assess those precursor skills, or there's the kind of pre-assessment that looks an awful lot like the summative, right?
Right.
And so we were giving kids those kinds of pre-assessments because that's
Hmm.
what we thought a pre-assessment was. And
Hmm.
what we started noticing with kids is they would write it and their confidence would like visibly plummet,
Yeah.
like visibly.
Yeah.
The questions were too hard. There were too many of them. They were discouraged. They started making excuses to sharpen their pencils and
Hmm.
go to the washroom and do all those things that we do to distract ourselves. And so we started to question that hard edge, right?
Yeah.
What could we do with pre-assessment to get the intellectual information that we needed to serve that whole part? What were the social emotional issues?
Yeah.
And confidence, of course, was the big one. And
Hmm.
so we started to realize, to soften the edge, we were going to have to really frame the pre-assessment in a way that kids understood how it was going to be used. And then we also
Hmm.
had to make sure that we actually used it that way
Right.
immediately, so kids felt
Right.
the impact of that. So really it was in how we presented it. And we also took off questions that were way too hard.
Hmm.
Like, there's no point giving kids 5 questions when they don't give you anything for all 5. All that does
Right.
is crush their
Right.
belief in themselves. So that's an
Yeah.
example.
Yeah. Pre-assessment is such an interesting concept because you're right. For so many years, pre-assessment was almost, here's an advanced version of the stuff we haven't taught you yet. And then why it took us so long to figure out why kids were losing confidence and doing poorly on the assessments of things they haven't been taught. Versus, versus
I
this
know.
idea that here's an assessment for readiness, right? So not every pre-assessment, like
Yeah.
a pre-test is a form of pre-assessment, but not every pre-assessment has to be a pre-test. And the idea of using it, I love your reference to the idea of using it, because is it just an assessment that we figure out who has the background knowledge and who doesn't, or are we actually going to use that instructionally? And I think that's really an important aspect that you highlight around pre-assessment, which I think is a really good place for people to start thinking about in terms of pre-assessment for sure. And
Well, and
now, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then the other way that sometimes pre-assessment is misused or used and then creates a hard edge, I guess
Yeah,
that's how I would like to say it, is when we're just collecting data to show growth. So we
right.
we want the kids to actually really do badly
Hmm.
because we need to prove that what we've done in the meantime has grown them.
Right,
And I think
right.
when we started to know that we were setting goals and trying to, there was actually some of that hokey stuff going on. Like, let's get the
Hmm.
lowest scores possible so that we
Right,
can do nothing but grow from there.
right.
I think we lost the thread on what a pre-assessment is
Yeah,
supposed to do.
totally. I mean, I've been saying for years in workshop, the easiest way to show growth is tank the pre-test. And right.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
yeah, and then you'll show
Oh,
tremendous growth, but that's not really a useful way to go about assessment for sure.
right.
So one more follow up to this.
Okay.
How what advice, like how as a teacher would I know, what should I keep in mind to make sure that I'm not inadvertently creating a hard edge? So I may think I'm
Yeah.
softening the edge, but there may be things that I do that inadvertently create a hard edge in assessment.
It's almost like action research, I think, is our big option here. So what I do in workshops with people around this is I actually invite them to attend to their emotional responses to assessment experiences and to watch kids emotional, because emotion indicates
Right.
either a need is being filled or it's not. And so
Mhm.
the example I always give is I used to take home, I'm an English language arts teacher, and I take home piles and piles of assessment, right? And then
Mhm.
I've got my kids home at night and I have to sit down and look at this pile, and I just feel this tension, this anger and frustration at my personal time being violated by this assessment thing that I have to do. So what I invite people to do is make a note of that somewhere. That's an indication of a hard edge. So there's something about the balance between home and school and the need for timely and effective
Yeah.
feedback, but also, so there's a way to win that. There's a way to soften that. We just have to investigate and identify it first. So watch kids if they're stuffing their tests in their desks or throwing them in the garbage, or if they're comparing with each other their scores, and you can see some kids feeling very diminished by that. I mean, those are all indicators of hard edges that we have to attend to. So just be observant, I think,
Yeah.
is what I'm inviting people to do.
Yeah. That emotional side of assessment is such an important part to pay attention to, is it's a very human experience and not just that clinical exercise and number crunching, right?
Right.
Page 82 of the book, you talk about committing to the process, right? So you talk about the idea that so often formative assessment, even in 2020, is often viewed as a distraction, from teaching. And Tom or Katie, if I'm always assessing, when am I teaching? Those types of mindsets. So how do we, or how have you, let's talk about how you have gone about trying to help teachers understand that assessment is an integral part of the instructional process and not a distraction from teaching. So what are some ways that we can begin to engineer that conversation and help people see that?
So I start with the definition of assessment, simplifying it as much as I can, which is simply clarifying or articulating our learning goals, capturing present state,
Hmm.
looking at the difference and responding. Like, that's what assessment is.
Yeah.
So when we assess kids, we're trying to uncover their thinking. Lots of it's happening inside their heads. We're trying to bring it out so that we can analyze it for current state and then make some decisions. So that's part of it, is redefining assessment. I think it's
Hmm.
gotten very convoluted.
Hmm.
But like, the number one way to share the impact of formative assessment, I think, is by having student artifacts in front of us. I just think it's the very best way, because when we bring student work into the room and we start to analyze it for strengths and needs, and we start to notice, teachers are passionate and caring human beings, and they want to do what's right and what's best by kids. And so when I'm looking at a student's work and I see that there's something missing or they hold a need, I can't ignore that anymore. Like, it's out of the box now. I can't put it back in. And so once we start looking at student work, that we collect from an assessment experience, then we can start to say, okay, so who needs what, and then how can I do that through feedback or practice or regrouping and explicit teaching? Like, what does that look like? So I feel like that's a great place to start, because it's hard to ignore that. But then I feel like the second part is where lots of us start, is we look at those learning goals and we break them into targets, which everyone in the world is doing, and all of that gorgeous work. But then there's a point, I feel like, where we also can have the conversation of, like, so let's look at those targets and those skills that we need to develop. Let's predict, based on our experience and what we know about kids this age and our subject area, let's predict where they're going to have the greatest challenge. So we put stars next to all of those things. Now, I mean, it becomes the conversation is, so if we know this is going to be a problem, wouldn't it be better to catch that earlier in the cycle than after a
Yeah.
summative event? Like, it's really about saving you time as a teacher. And I feel like that conversation of predicting needs and then planning to
Mhm.
catch them early is another way to come at it.
It's interesting when you think about that, just starting with that latter point, the idea that it's almost a trade-off in terms of your minutes, right? It's
Yeah.
investing in the work ahead of time so that you're not spending as much time on the back end. So things that are always front end loaded are, I guess, perceived to be risky because you don't see the payoff until after the fact, right? I love the idea of teaching through student exemplars and samples because one of the things that I know you talk a lot about, and we all do, which is that an assessment isn't formative unless it's used formatively. And so showing the utility of the idea of looking at strengths and that which needs strengthening, I think that sort of learn by doing idea of putting student work in front of teachers and having them see that there is a connection to the instructional decisions. I just think that's really, really wise. You also talk a lot about self-assessment and metacognition in the book. And I think, again, we know that those are two aspects of assessment that are almost universally accepted in theory. I think there aren't many people now that don't understand how critical it is to have students as self-assessors and the idea that I am thinking about my own learning or my thinking through a metacognitive experience. But we know that understanding it in theory and putting it into practice in your classroom are often two different things. So what strategies or advice or suggestions do you have for teachers who are trying to bring more self-assessment to their classroom or more metacognitive opportunities for students? Like, what advice do you have for teachers? Like, where should they begin? How can they begin to fold more of that into their classroom practices if they don't have a lot of experience doing so already?
Well, I just sent in a draft for a new book on this very topic. So I'll share. So I've had a
Okay.
chance to really hone in my thinking on this one.
All
Plus,
right.
I just adjusted some of this stuff, and I'm teaching
Awesome.
ELA 10 and 20, and I just this morning adjusted a self-assessment
Perfect.
tool
So
so I'm ready.
we are
I'm
getting
ready.
a preview to the new masterpiece from Katie White. So let's do it.
Ta-da. We'll
Here
see.
we go. Let's
Okay,
do it.
so the first thing that that I would recommend is documentation. So it's really tough for kids to reflect on decisions that they've made, which is what a self-assessment really needs to be, if they don't have something to look at, right? So having them collect work in a portfolio or a data notebook, or having them, having a video that they can look at, or a series of photographs, just giving them something. Especially with our little people, I mean, their memories are pretty like in this moment. And so to say, hey, remember 2 hours ago when, you had the puppet and you punched a kid? It's just nice to have something to look at, to analyze, right? And then,
Right.
the second part is having a process for analysis that the kids can undergo that's a little bit different than what I think we would traditionally say. So how do you think you did is what we usually ask. How do you think this went? It's that's too nebulous for kids. So having them look at two different samples of work and say, how did one change from the other one, or what decisions did you make differently? Or let's look at the introduction. Which introduction do you think was most effective? I just feel like the analysis combined with a really strong set of prompts or ways to think about their work. They can look at work or they can look at data, either, really helps them. And then emerging from that, of course, then is goal setting. And so I feel like one of the key things that I would say to people around goal setting with kids, because again, this traditionally goes badly, like, I'm going to be neater. Or even when I asked my high school kids the very first round, they said, well, I'm gonna try and read every day. Well, okay. So what we want to get at is really short-term, tight goals where kids can see a turnaround, they can make a decision and apply it within 24 hours. So really being clear about, like, specifically what are you going to try, and let's try it tomorrow, and then let's see what results you get. I think that sort of recursive part is really important. And then the last thing I would say, well, actually I have two things, but the last thing I would say, the last big thing is let it be organic. Like, be okay with an organic self-assessment process. Like, it doesn't have to be, here's a big template and fill it out and fill out your goals and it's so cumbersome for kids sometimes. So recognizing, I think, self-assessment through the course of a daily teaching experience is super helpful. Like, did you notice how, when you took the puppet from your friend, they got
Mhm.
upset? What
Mhm.
might you do differently, right? That
Right,
is
right,
self-assessment, and it's very organic, and it can happen through the course
right.
of a regular class. And then the last thing I want to talk about, because this is the most controversial part of my book, I feel like, is the idea of privacy. Um, I feel like some kids are a little bit afraid of self-assessment because it inadvertently becomes kind of public.
Right.
Like, I'm working in a group of people, or I have to share my data with others, or I'm having a conversation with the teacher and there's two other kids standing there. And I feel like it's just self-assessment. I mean, for adults is vulnerable work. We're
Mhm.
talking about ourselves and our decisions. And so I just want to throw a little statement out there that just we have to attend to the privacy of kids
Yeah,
and let them retain their dignity while taking
right.
risks and making mistakes. I think that's part of that culture.
Yeah, that is a such a great point because it does in a self-assessment and even more so in a peer assessment situation, it is you are vulnerable. And if the context doesn't support, like if we don't have a norm of working together, if we don't have a norm of support where I'm not going to be laughed at or people aren't going to make fun of me, if we don't have those things in place where there's this the attention to the collective versus, I've often said to people, if grades are competitive in your classroom, then students are going to have no interest in peer assessment or helping one another
Yeah.
because they're not going to want to help you gain an advantage over them. So that context really matters, and the safety of that exercise, Katie, I think is such a brilliant point to make about that self-assessment, because it is somewhat public, and kids do feel vulnerable, and even adults feel vulnerable, as you said. So I think that's really important. Again, like, everything around hard and soft edges, it's always attending to the emotional side of the experience and not just the
Mhm.
clinical side of the experience. And I also love the idea that it not always be such an epic monumental event, but it's more a natural part of what we do on a daily basis. So I think that's really really wise advice for people thinking about how to get themselves moving in that direction. I want to shift now to talk a little bit about creativity, because of course in the book Unlocked, you assert that creativity is supported by assessment, or assessment is the key to everyday creativity. So from your perspective, what are some of the, I guess, biggest misunderstandings that teachers have, or people in general? What are some of the biggest misunderstandings people have from your perspective about creativity? When you hear creativity, what are some people still not understanding completely?
So much.
The
So many of the things.
floor is yours,
Um,
Katie.
okay. Well, I think first of all, creativity feels big to people, right? So if I'm going to invest in a creative process, this is going to be time consuming. It's going to be so messy. It's going to be chaotic in my room. The rules are going to go out the window. The kids are going to be able to do whatever they want. I think it's this this notion of the creative process being a giant thing, and it is a giant thing in terms of thinking, and it's very recursive, and it gets us
Mhm.
really deeper and deeper into goals and what we want. But it doesn't have to be that big. There's the literature talks about big C creativity and little c creativity. A big C creativity is what, like, professional inventors and people who are doing this work do, and it's huge. But that's not what we're doing in classrooms. We're doing little c, like, in this moment, what are the 5 questions you have, and what are ways we can answer that, or
Mhm.
here's some materials, what might you do with that? We can tighten up, I guess, the scope of something like that. The other and another one is, people think that either you're creative or you're not.
Mhm.
That's, I mean, and even when I say to people, well, do you really think that's true? They'll be like, no, okay, maybe, but I can't draw anything but a stick person, or math's my thing. I'm not creative at all. I hear that from people all the time. And creativity it's a set of skills that we can develop. That creative thinking is a muscle that you have to work. And I know everyone's creative. You know, when people say I can't do art, I always say, well, you didn't have the right art teacher. Like, yes, you can.
Yeah.
You just need someone to help you with the process.
Yeah.
So that's another big one. And then I think that a lot of people feel discouraged by creativity or trying creativity, whatever that is, when they don't get good results right away. It's like kids who think they can write a draft and that's going to be publishable. You know, the
Right.
creative process takes time.
Mm-hmm.
It's rigorous. You have to make lots and lots of mistakes, and then you get one great idea. And I feel like having teachers and students be comfortable with that ambiguity and that failure takes a real cultural shift in a classroom. And so we have to do some work around that, right?
Yeah.
And then I would say one more thing, because I have to make a case for those little people in classrooms who don't get to do the creative stuff because they're not done the other stuff. Like, creativity isn't an afterthought. And it's not, you know, when you think of Bloom's, it's not like creativity is at the top, but that doesn't mean we have to go through each of those other stages to get to it. Sometimes through creativity, we can get to asking questions about knowledge and analyzing things. So let's not withhold creativity from kids because they don't have the rest of their work done. I just feel so sad for those little people, because that's joy, right? They need a chance to do that kind of thing.
So is the first step broadening our definition of what we mean when we say creativity or creative thinking? Is that the first? Because I know that, you know, over a decade ago, when we were going through some of the changes in our curriculum here in BC, people said the same thing. Oh, you know, I can't assess, I can't teach creativity because I'm not an art teacher. And they have such a narrow view that teaching creativity means producing something that is aesthetically pleasing, as opposed to broadening the definition. So is that the first step for us all, is to broaden our understanding of the definition, or what is actually creative? Because I think about teachers who on a daily basis are creative in helping students grasp concepts and dig deeper in inquiry where the students weren't already. So a teacher might think they're not creative, but in the professional setting, they're incredibly creative in their work. So is that a fair thing to start with? Is that if we all collectively broadened our definition of that?
Definitely. You know, I even have people say to me, well, Katie, are you still doing art, or are you playing music? Because I'm a very creative person. And I'll say, no, I'm not finding that I have a lot of time for that, but I do feel like I'm exercising my creativity through designing a session for teachers, or thinking about how to write something for a newsletter. So creativity comes in all shapes and sizes. And I think one of the most helpful definitions for me, or ways to think about it, is creativity is solving problems. So it's visual problems in visual art, right? It's the problem of you know, dramatic communication in drama. But in math, it's like looking at a complex problem and trying to figure out how you might solve it. And Sir Ken Robinson, who I love and adore, reminds us that creativity doesn't have to be new to the, it doesn't have to be new to the world. It can be new to the person. So you can have kids who come up with two creative solutions that look the same, but the creative process still existed, because it's about the thinking and the you know, the trying ideas on. And so I think also we have to lower our expectations in terms of, well, you came up with something that looked a little bit like the kid over here. That's how creativity works. We build off each other. My mom uses the term riff. We're always riffing off each other, trying to figure out what someone's doing, and then we build on it. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Tom. I think that's a good first step.
It's interesting when you say that, because like you could have a teacher who has, you know, 120 students on their roster. How new to the world is everything? You know, by the 60th student, you're going to probably see that repetitiveness in terms of what the student's doing. So I love that idea of new to the individual. It's a new way of thinking for me. It also makes me think about, you know, when we talk about 21st century competencies, the way you're talking about creativity, you're almost bringing together creativity and critical thinking, as instead of thinking of these competencies as silos, they really are interrelated. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how we bring all of those 21st century competencies together, and how that kind of flows?
So it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's how my work has actually really evolved in BC, specifically around those competencies. Is I started talking about creativity. I wrote a book about creativity, but I've actually changed my language to deep thinking, and problem solving, because in the book I talk about 4 stages, and the stage names are of my own creation to some degree, although other people suggested them. But in the literature, no matter where you read, there's several stages of creativity. So we start with exploration, we move on to elaboration, then some form of expression or sharing, and then a deep reflection and connection to the next task. That's the cycle. Well,
Right.
that cycle serves critical thinking too, right? Like, it's, let's talk about what we're seeing and what do we notice, and then let's analyze the similarities to something else. And so each of those competencies require that sort of leveling up of thinking and getting deeper and deeper into something. And I think that's the connection, is almost the idea of slowing down, the assign, assess cycle, and actually saying, how can we invite kids into thinking or creating or communicating? How can we get them to elaborate on their ideas? How can we get them ready to share with somebody? And how can we get them to do some of that reflection? I think it
Yeah.
applies to all of those competencies. It's really how
Right.
we develop them.
Right. It's one of the challenges, of course, with creativity is, as you mentioned, time, right? So
Yeah.
the idea that I want to let an idea or a thought or a potential solution incubate, but have it done by Monday. It's that, it's that rushing, and that may be one of the biggest challenges teachers face is allowing the space and the time for students to think with creative intent and beginning to sort of manifest their ideas in the time it takes, and not being rushed. So assessment is the key to everyday creativity, you say. How so?
Yeah, that's a big statement. So when you think about those 4 stages, expression, elaboration, no, sorry, exploration, elaboration, expression, and reflection response. Um, I guess what I'm contending is that the only way that we can get kids to dig deeper into their work is through assessment. Because if we go back to that definition that I mentioned before, it's like, where am I trying to go and what's my current state? And I always think of, like, I teach evening, or I used to teach evening art classes for many years, and I would get kids who would come up to me with their canvas, and they would say, am I done? Am I done? Is this good? And I'd look at it and I would see, like, the same picture that they painted yesterday. Right. And so I have that moment, I call it sort of that pivotal moment as a teacher. And we've all had it, where kids come to us and give us more of the same. And we can either say, yeah, that fits the criteria, so sure, hand it in, which is what sometimes we do. Or we can say, you know what? No, you've done this already. You're really great at that. So let's try something different. And the only way you're going to get kids to move from that exploration, which is what I think that first draft is, to that elaboration, is to say, let's set a new goal. Let's think about what we're, is there a way that we might create a background that isn't always brown? Let's think about other colors, other textures. Here's some new materials. Let's see what you might do. And so it's almost asking another question or posing another problem, and then sending them back and saying, let's see if you can resolve this. And and because I'm using assessment in that very open-ended definition, I just don't think there's another way to get kids to get back into their work. And we call it different things. We call it revision in English language arts, right? Or sketching in art. All of those sort of, that's your first kick at it. Let's dig back in. And I think we want to do that in math, and I think we want to do that in science. Like, that's great. Is there another way that you might have solved that exact same problem? Head back and see if you can come up with another solution. That's how we get kids to dig in. So that's why I say creativity and assessment go hand in hand. And then I talk really explicitly about, I call it dialogue with self and dialogue with others. So dialogue with others is feedback, of course, and dialogue with self is self-assessment, but really working alongside other people to push ourselves to do different, to try different. We might not have strategies in our brains at this moment, but if I talk to someone else and they said they tried something else, then maybe I'm going to try that on my piece. And so it's that whole sort of assess, set a new goal, try, reflect, assess, that cycle that really drives the creative process.
Yeah, it just reiterates the notion of assessment as the engine or the center of so much that drives. It's not always the most glamorous part of our jobs, and it isn't necessarily the stuff that makes the headlines, but it certainly is that engine that drives so many of the different processes that we want to see happen in our classrooms, and the way that we can engineer further conversations about thinking creatively and critically and all of that. So I love that. And again, for some listeners or others, the concept of linking assessment and creativity may be foreign. They may feel that there's that disconnect, but I think that what the case you make in the book is just irrefutable in terms of how assessment can drive that creative process. So I love that. So I hope listeners check out both books, because they really are excellent reads. I want to finish up with a question about, I know, like myself, you've been working with a lot of schools remotely. You've been working with schools that are there, schools across North America and around the world are in different situations. Many are still in full remote learning situations. Some schools are in kind of hybrid situations. Some are back in different iterations of being back face-to-face, and whatever that looks like. So let's talk about remote learning or hybrid learning to finish up. Because of your work, and you've been working with so many of these schools, what assessment advice are you giving to teachers right now? Or do you have for teachers? Like what is some of the advice you're giving about how to navigate this sort of 2021 school year? What's some of the advice you're giving to people about, from an assessment perspective, on navigating the unknown about what this school year could look like?
Well, I have to say that one of the best things I ever did was take a teaching contract, because there is just nothing that brings this stuff home more than
Yeah.
teaching asynchronously in
Hmm.
an online environment. So my advice has become like quite fine-tuned. So I think I've adopted Brené Brown's saying, "Clear is kind," and I say it to myself and I say it to others all the time. Right? That at this time, we have to be clear about some things, and we have to be clear ourselves, and then also with the students we serve. And I feel like that clarity brings comfort
Hmm.
to kids. I mean, we talk about routines, but I honestly, we just need clarity.
Yeah.
There's nothing that makes us feel worse than not knowing what's
Hmm.
happening. And that's why we all feel crazy right now. So I talk lots about prioritizing goals. I mean, I think I focus on that because I had to reckon with that myself in my own practice. I have kids. I designed a course the best I could, and the kids aren't going to finish it. They're just not going to finish it. They don't have enough
Right.
time. It's a quarterly system where it's crazy. So I had to do this exact same thing in my practice. Like, what has to stay? What does every kid need, and what are some things where I can flex that a little bit?
Hmm.
And so I talk lots about prioritization, and the other side of prioritization, of course, I talk about the other side of that coin, which is, if we prioritize, then we have to commit to feedback, to formative assessment, to practice, to time for kids to recover. So if we're going to get kids to engage in that, again, that deep learning cycle, we have to
Hmm.
reduce the amount that we're going to do.
Yeah.
Otherwise, sure, I mean, like I say, yeah, we could do them all. We could do all the assignments and all the competencies and all the outcomes, and we can do it all. But it's very shallow. 50% of our kids won't learn a thing, and we're
Hmm.
going to burn ourselves out. So we have to be
Right.
true to that. That's a big one. And then the other one is really talking a lot about success criteria, but in a more um, I guess, open way. Like I use the phrase, and lots of people use the phrase, "this means that." And so really helping kids
Hmm.
understand exactly what we mean by a skill that we're trying to develop.
Hmm.
And then being super clear with kids, using that exact same list of descriptors when we give kids feedback, when they're setting goals, they're tracking their own progress. So just being super clear about that.
Hmm.
And then also talking about two-way feedback. I talk about that a lot.
Right.
because I get humble pie every day from the kids, the kids I'm teaching. I got a kid today yesterday sent me a text and say, okay, so you have 2 different persuasive essays. Like, are you saying we have to do both of those? And I was like, okay, yes. So is this taking you a long time? Or it's that whole discussion, I think, about pacing and managing the workload with everything else that's happening. I think there has to be a back and forth to that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So those are some of the things.
Yeah, all really good advice for sure. And I think the highlighting of the idea that while you can prioritize and reduce the quantity, it's really important that you increase the quality of that
Yeah.
experience. And the idea that you say commit to the process of formative assessment and feedback. So you can just do less, but we're not doing it any better because we're not committed to that. So I love that you highlighted that important point, and just understanding that we just can't cover everything we would cover in a face-to-face situation. Some teachers struggle to cover everything in a face-to-face situation, never mind the remote
we
learning.
never could, Tom, could we?
Right.
Like, we
Right.
never
No,
could. My
exactly.
fractions unit always got kind of short
That's right.
shifted in June
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I ran out of time, right? Like, it
Yeah.
happens. So
We even had
this
that
is just being more
expression.
intentional.
That expression in the early days of my teaching was you always run out of time before you run out of textbook. And so we're always making those choices and things like that. But I think that's really, really great advice. So, okay, Katie, I could talk assessment with you all day. Like when I had Nicole on, I mean, because we could do hours of this, and I know we're going to do this again at some point. But I want to finish up today with a little bit of fun. As you know, I finish up every interview with some fun questions. I'm going to ask you a few lighthearted questions that you don't know are coming. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. But this is I think, a good way for listeners to get to know you a little bit on a personal level. So I have 5 questions for you, and then we'll finish up with a question about success. So here's the first one. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all and 10 being off the charts, how strict were your parents when you were growing up?
Okay, that's a new one, Tom Schimmer. I think it depends on the parent we're talking about, but
well, you're going to have to synthesize it into an overall grade.
Okay, I don't like this holistic approach. I think maybe 7.
Okay.
7 to 8. I think when I was a teenager, my dad was pretty strict. He was quite frustrated with me. So yeah, my parents were not lenient, but they also, I mean, I always joke, I grew up in a town with 250 people, and my mom had the dryer going in spring, and the 3 of us would just wander around town and get wet in puddles, come home, chuck a pair of pants in the dryer, grab a new pair, and head out again. And the town just took care of us. So it's kind of like a balance between that sort of free and easy 1970s vibe, but as I progressed into my adolescent years, I think things tightened up significantly.
Yeah. Well, that's probably very common in many households for sure. All right, number 2. What's the most overrated movie of all time? The movie that everybody loves, but you just don't get it.
I'm going to make this a slightly different answer. Like, I'm disappointed in movies all the time. I actually have started to think that there's something wrong with me, because I just don't enjoy lots of pop culture-y kind of movies. I don't know. So that's all I would say. There's so many. Like, I haven't even watched Gladiator, Tom. Like, what's wrong with me? Like, I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's just, so there's no movie that you think about where you saw it and you're like, why was everybody so excited about that? I guess there's many of them, as you're saying. So that's okay. It's okay if, I know I'm putting you on the spot. Go ahead.
Inception, but not because it wasn't a great movie. I actually think Inception was probably a great movie for people who are a lot smarter than me. But I struggled with the layers. I needed my kids to explain it to me. So maybe that's the one. It wasn't bad. It's just, I don't know that I was smart enough to take it.
Well, and overrated doesn't have to mean it was bad. It just means it's overrated, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. We'll move on to question 3. Here's an either or choice: Han Solo or Indiana Jones.
Oh my word. I gotta go with Indiana Jones.
Okay, explain.
Oh, but that's tough. Like, well, because I've watched every Indiana Jones movie like 100 times. I love, there's something about that series that just, I'll have a Saturday where I'm just feeling like I need an Indiana Jones movie and I watch it. And I feel like he's just a rascal and I like the guy and he's smart and he's brave. And I like that. And I feel like Han Solo could have been that, except like his part was too small. He didn't get to fully live out his character because there were so many other characters. So I got to go with Indiana Jones.
Okay. All right. Indiana Jones it is. Okay. Number 4, a little Canadiana here for listeners. What is your favorite? And let's talk maybe unknown, maybe not popular outside of Canada, but what's your favorite unknown Canadian band or singer that our American listeners or international listeners definitely have to start listening to that they may not know about? So recommendation: great Canadian band or singer that listeners in the United States or overseas should really start listening to.
Well, okay. So my first thought is Andy Schaff, and he's from southern Saskatchewan, and he is wonderful. Like look him up, Spotify that guy. His music is quirky and awesome, but President Obama actually tweeted about him in his list of music. So like I
Oh.
think he's kind of blown up because of that, not because Katie White said it, but because
Well,
Obama
now he's
said it.
definitely going to blow up.
Like, but he's up until then was relatively unknown, and I'm super curious how that even happened. So he's
Mhm.
one guy, and my kids love him, and he's just awesome. And then like a bit old, I got to go old school with you, Tom, and you'll relate to this. I really love Wide Mouth Mason.
Mm.
They were a band also from Saskatchewan, really bluesy, jazzy rock. Had some popular songs a number of years ago, but Sean Verow, the lead singer, is still messing around. His Instagram account is crazy. He's so musical, and so I feel like that's a great band. And then I have to sneak in the Northern Pikes, who are also
Okay.
from Saskatoon.
Okay.
They've got some great old songs that you can check out. There's so
Yeah,
many. Canadian
absolutely.
music is awesome.
Yes, it is. Great recommendations there, Katie. Thanks for that. Um, all right, last one. What is one irresistible thing that is guaranteed to distract you from getting any work done? What's that one thing that is guaranteed to distract you if you're writing or you're preparing or you're whatever you're trying to get done? It for sure will take you away from doing that.
My answer is disappointing. It's it's email notifications. Truthfully, it is. And you know what? I know that this is a ridiculous thing and I'm supposed to turn those off, but I will tell you, I can be working and just be in flow. I'm doing so good. And then it's only my iPad that has the signal in the sound, and I'll be like, whoop, all of a sudden I have an email and I cannot leave it alone. So that's the truth of it. That's about the only thing that interrupts me.
So not TikTok, not no, nothing like that. Okay. All right. So one final question, Katie. And as listeners know, I ask this question of everyone who comes on the podcast that I interview, and it has to do with success. One of the things that I'm going to be eventually exploring through the podcast is just this idea of success and happiness, and in whatever walk of life you are in. So the question I ask everyone is, and I'm sure you've heard it, but the question is, if you were stopped on the street, if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what's your definition of success? How would you answer them?
In my workshops, sometimes I remind people that the conversation is the destination, or the journey is the destination, and that our fixation on this sort of endpoint success, right, can sometimes take us away from the present moment. And so like I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm alone in my house during the COVID
Mhm.
thing. And I just really think that life is a whole bunch of present moments strung together, right, into this life. And I feel like, success for me is staying present,
Mhm.
not obsessing about the future or the past or things outside of me. And I think that that's what my daily work is, to be curious, and to, if I'm with people, I'm really with people. My dad used to have a saying. My dad is definitely one of my heroes, and he used to say that, when I talk to people, I want them to feel better after talking to me than they did before I talked to them. And he had a real servant leadership perspective, and I think I've very much internalized that. So success to me is helping people feel better about whatever it is that matters to them right now. And then that's like right from my professional life to my personal life. I want to be present, and I'm not always successful in that even. That's a real struggle for me. But I just think that's what success is. It's that this moment is a gift, and that I see it as that, and I treat it as that.
Yeah, it's being present is never a bad thing. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Katie, look, this was great. Like I said, I could talk assessment with you all day, and I know that we will do this again. I really appreciate you joining me today. Listeners, I want to encourage you to follow Katie's work on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is @KatieWhite426. She also blogs regularly at the website allthingsassessment.info, where all of us post our blog posts occasionally. That's where you can find many of Katie's blogs. Katie is also the co-moderator of the All Things Assessment chat. So that's hashtag AT Assessment. And that chat happens every other Tuesday on Twitter at 6 o'clock Pacific, 9 o'clock Eastern time. So if you're interested in joining many of us on that Twitter chat to talk assessment, Katie also moderates that. Katie, anywhere else people can follow your work at all? Any other platforms or anything like that?
Well, I've got a website, kwhiteconsulting.com.
Okay.
And there's more than one Katie White Consulting. So you got to type in education if you're doing a Google search, and you'll find me. And I also have started a professional Instagram account called
Okay.
Soft Edged Learning. And I'm trying to, it's almost like a half blog, half Instagram. I try to document my journey as a classroom teacher right now, and some of the things that are happening in education. So that's another place where you can find me.
Awesome. So listeners, no shortage of ways that you can connect with Katie, that's for sure. And I can promise you, connecting with Katie's work is worth it. She is just a force when it comes to assessment, and an absolute gift to teachers in terms of her knowledge and her experience in all the work that she does. So Katie, I know we'll do this again at some point, but I'm just very grateful that you took the time to join me today. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Tom.